Power shortages are not a distant possibility. This is a reality for us right now, and I hope to prove that to you in this video. The reality is that you will face power shortages in the future because America is running out of power. Now, let's start out with defining a power shortage, because I'm not talking about peak summer demand causing brownouts, although that will remain a risk both for summer and winter months. A power shortage is when demand is higher than net electricity production, which causes blackouts and brownouts. These can be planned outages, so scheduled in advance, or they can happen without notice. We will be at risk of power shortages in the coming years. And I want to share with you why I think that, and also just let you decide for yourself. I just ask one thing. If you come to the same conclusion that I have, then please share this video with family and friends, because the second and third order effects, the things that break down following these power outages, are going to affect virtually everybody. And it's just going to be part of this continuing downward slide into the third world for us in parts of the United States. Now, just briefly, I'm Mike Shelby. I was an intelligence NCO. I spent 3 years in Iraq and Afghanistan on various intelligence missions, both as a soldier and a contractor. And now I run the Early Warning Intelligence Network, and that's important, and I'll tell you about that later. I got into preparedness once I realized the volume of problems that this country faces and the potential for cascading effects from a single point of failure. We've already seen this happen a few times over the past several years, and I think that future failure cascades will be worse. And so that's where I'm coming from, and let's get into the data here. First, net electrical generation is just about flat from the peaks of 2007 to the peaks of 2022 and 2023. And we can see this across multiple data sources. The latest projections show that total production will rise slightly for 2024 and 2025, which is really great news considering we're hitting peak demand this year and next year as well. So total net electrical production is virtually flat, even though we hit record electricity demand in 2023. We'll hit new highs in 2024, then again in 2025, and probably every year after that as well. Now let's go back to 2007, 2010. This was a time when the adoption curve for electric vehicles didn't exist. The mandates for electric vehicle fleets didn't exist. Political efforts to ban internal combustion engines didn't exist. Artificial intelligence data centers didn't exist. Even just those regular data centers for storage and cloud computing were still on the front edge of their growth curve. Now, these things draw huge amounts of power. One AI data center can draw about the same electrical power as a small town, and it takes constant generation. This is not something that you want to run on wind or solar, which is less reliable. When the wind stops blowing, the power stops generating, and you can't generate solar energy at night. So because of these reliability issues, there are estimates that it takes about 5 watts of green energy to achieve the same reliability as about 1 watt of fossil fuel production. Maintaining an uninterrupted power supply to these data centers takes large and very expensive batteries if you're relying on so-called green energy, and it's just not economical in most instances. You actually look at the green energy production process, and you'll also find out it's not very green. The chart on the left here shows the massive growth of electrical demand for AI data centers. They're running right now an average of 10% compounded annual growth. So for you math majors out there, electrical demand for these AI data centers, which are popping up all over the place, will double every 7 years or so. And that's probably an underestimation as well. Current expectations right now, which are also probably underestimated, say that data center power consumption will grow to about 35 gigawatts by the year 2030. And construction delays for these AI data centers are increasing because we're running out of power. These AI data centers are currently some of them are currently being delayed by 2 years, in some cases 6 years, because there's just not enough power in these areas. And artificial intelligence is a geostrategic concern for the United States. Whatever you think about AI, this is not an area where we want the Chinese to have a massive advantage, certainly not because we don't have enough electricity to run our own AI systems, but this is exactly where we are. For 3 years now, planners have upward revised future electricity demand. And this is mostly due to the electrification of everything. So lots of things that used to be manual or analog are now digital and electrified. Home heating especially. But we added that electric vehicles, transportation. We have lots of new electrical gadgets. Data centers are probably the single biggest driver of increasing demand, and this is not something that our grids are prepared for. There are also efforts to reindustrialize the United States, so bringing critical manufacturing back to the U.S., and lots of people are asking, where are we going to get the power to run these industrial manufacturing centers? And there are no good answers. BlackRock's Larry Fink recently spoke to this problem, and he said, among other things, quote, "We will run out of electricity if we are going to fully adapt to this new AI world we live in." So the first major point here is that pre-existing projections for electrical demand are wrong. They've been underestimating future demand growth by 50% each year. In other words, total projected new demand has doubled since last year's projections. And even that is probably being underestimated. I guess we'll find out next year. But neither our grids nor the total generating capacity that we currently have are prepared for that level of demand. Now let's briefly get into some history. Why is the situation unlikely to improve before the power shortages start? Well, the reason has to do with political policies predominantly. These power shortages are a political choice. Let's start off with the EPA's Clean Power Plan 2.0. Initially, there was a Clean Power Plan 1.0, and it was officially unveiled during the Obama administration back in 2015. The goal was to reduce carbon emissions from electricity production by about 30% by the year 2030. And they would do this by canceling planned expansions of existing power plants, primarily fossil fuel power plants, and then sending other fossil fuel power plants into early retirement. And that was our starting point for all this. This chart right here shows you the retiring generating capacity from 2008 to 2020. In 2017, the Trump administration killed the Clean Power Plan, and it was no more until 2021, when Biden's EPA reintroduced it as the Clean Power Plan 2.0, which sought to accelerate the retirements of fossil fuel power plants. And how would the EPA accomplish this? By imposing unrealistic emission standards that would force those plants to close down. And so after the announcement of the Clean Power Plan 2.0, fossil fuel plant owners preemptively started plans to shut down their plants due to these new emissions rules. So we already have issues with grid reliability and generating capacity, and yet we are still retiring power plants faster than we can replace them with these so-called green alternatives. And this chart that you're looking at now shows the additions, cancellations, and retirements of power production from 2016 to 2023. And as you can see, about 253,000 megawatts have been added. But I really want to draw your attention to the cancellations. 340,000 megawatts have been canceled. These were planned expansions of existing power plants, and those plans were canceled. And then about 144,000 megawatts of production have been retired. Here's another look at planned retirements. And note this huge uptick from 2025 to 2028. This is when we're actually going to hit these power shortage crises, and they're going to affect multiple parts of the United States if nothing changes. Now, I've noticed a huge divergence between what government outlets are saying and what energy production companies are saying. This chart is from the Energy Information Agency. It's the most recent I could find, and notably, there will be no annual Energy Outlook report published this year. That may have contained newer projections. I think it's pretty suspect, given that they're not producing this report in a year where the data is going to be pretty obvious to everyone in this country, everyone who reads it. But this chart, nonetheless, shows projections of new generating capacity coming online as of this 2022 report. And it looks to be enough to offset the retirements, right? This new generating capacity looks like it's more than the retirements. You add 54 gigawatts of new production this year, and you retire 15 gigawatts, and you still add a net of 39 gigawatts, right? And that is technically accurate. But most of this new expansion is coming from so-called green energy, like solar and wind. And these big green and yellow bars may look nice, and the numbers may look good on paper, but they represent maximum generation capacity under optimal conditions. Under suboptimal conditions, net electricity production will be lower. And of course, wind and solar are less reliable. They're subject to weather-related disruption. There's also increased maintenance costs and physical maintenance that has to be done. They have shorter lifespans than fossil fuel plants. And so the numbers that are being produced by the government are not reflective of actual net production, which is what powers the country. Now, there are several other factors here to consider. One of those is that it's not enough just to build a new solar power plant in the desert somewhere or throw up wind turbines on the plains. Those new green energy sources have to be connected to the grid, and that takes transmission lines, which are getting more costly and taking longer to build. We're also building about 50% less transmission lines today than we were a decade ago. And so this is delaying some of this new generating capacity from being distributed throughout these regions. Now, there are some efforts right now to do what's called reconductoring. And that's when they go in and they replace the existing steel core power lines with carbon fiber. And in places where this has been done, electrical transmission has increased by about 40%, which sounds great until you look at the details. And they actually did this down in the Rio Grande Valley here in Texas. And it took them nearly 3 years to do 240 miles of reconductoring. And we don't have 3 years. This is a today problem. And it's going to really start affecting us next year. Now, another factor is the economic mismatch between the Biden administration's environmental policies and the economic realities of electrical power generation. Federal authorities want grid operators to rely on green energy as their primary electrical source and then use these fossil fuel plants as a backup during periods of higher base demand. But this is not economical for these plant operators. If you run a natural gas-fired power plant, you're not just going to sit around and twiddle your thumbs until you need to come in and fire up your plant to back up solar and wind. You're losing money. And so this has forced some of them into unplanned early retirements. And I suspect that early retirement and unplanned closures for these economic reasons are going to increase the amount of total generating capacity going offline in the years to come, which is going to make this situation worse. Now, this chart is from the North American Electricity Reliability Corporation, and it shows generating capacity buffers over the next 10 years. So we have this extra generating capacity for the Midwest that falls from about 25% this year to just 5% by 2034. And that's if nothing changes, and this is probably a best case scenario. New England's buffer falls from about 25% this year to less than 10% by 2034. Again, these are margins. So shrinking margins increases the risk of these power outages. The Pacific Northwest falls from about 42% this year to just 7% by 2032. So to summarize, extra capacity to respond to peak demand is set to fall for large parts of the country over the next 10 years, while unanticipated demand is rising rapidly. And this is why the NERC continues to warn about power shortages under normal peak conditions. In 2023, they warned about peak demand rising at an alarming rate, which we already covered. This year, they warned, quote, a large part of North America remains at risk of supply shortfalls, and this is due to the retirement of reliable fossil fuel plants, which are not being replaced quickly enough with adequate green energy alternatives. The two regions at the highest risk for this year are the Midwest and Southwest, which under perfect storm conditions could experience reserve deficiency during peak demand. That means power shortages and most likely power outages. So overall, the NERC says there should be enough generating capacity to power the United States during normal conditions this year. But that changes starting next year, when net generation starts to become inadequate for some areas. According to the NERC, quote, a growing number of areas in North America face adequacy risks as early as 2025. And we're looking at areas of the Midwest and the Southeast because they're at the highest risk for these capacity deficits where power shortfalls occur at normal peak conditions. We're not even talking about extreme conditions, just normal peak conditions here. The Midwest specifically is expected to have a 4.7 gigawatt shortfall starting in 2027, while parts of Tennessee and the Ozarks are at risk of power shortages from 2025 through 2027, and this is due to rapidly increasing demand. The fact is that any of these regions could experience power shortages due to extreme weather, and you will. But the NERC also notes that this is a rising risk for multiple parts of the country, including California, where they say that these resource adequacy risks over the medium and long term have risen significantly. Now, regardless of what you think about Elon Musk, when he talks about threats to his industry or threats to his company, I will listen to him. Back in 2023, he said, quote, we have a silicon shortage now that will transition into a voltage transformer shortage in about a year, and then just electricity shortage in general in about 2 years. Now, he said this in 2023. You add 2 years, you get 2025, which is the time period where we're talking about here, according to This is what the data says. And then earlier this year, Musk said essentially the same thing, quote, the next shortage will be electricity. They won't be able to find enough electricity to run all the chips. I think next year, talking about 2025, you'll see that they just can't find enough electricity to run all the chips. And this is not just Elon Musk saying this. JP Morgan's Michael Cembalest also shared a list of surprise predictions for next year. And here's what he said. Quote, due to retirement of dispatchable power generation, major U.S. cities will face electricity outages. Now, there are 3 intermediate-term risks to our grids that we face in addition to power shortages and actual outages. Before I cover those, I mentioned that I run the Early Warning Network, which is an intelligence network of like-minded Americans sharing information and preparing for these reality-based emergency scenarios. I gave this full presentation to Early Warning Network members, and you're watching about the first half of it. And this full presentation included a section on preparing not just for these planned and unplanned power outages, but for the second and third order effects, the potential panic buying because the grocery stores are going to close during these planned power outages, the potential for fuel shortages or fuel rationing and supply chain disruption, and the economic and financial disruption because you can't swipe a credit card during these power shortages. And then there's preparing for food spoilage, extreme heat and cold, health and safety of loved ones like infants and the elderly. And there's some other critical vulnerabilities that we covered as well. Now, I want to underscore that the worst case scenario is rarely the most likely, but tens of millions of Americans are going to be affected if nothing changes. And truth be told, I think the Biden administration probably wants these power shortages so that Americans will demand new power plants. And of course, there will be federally mandated green energy power plants to funnel money through the federal government patronage network because they reward their friends. But I'll let you decide that for yourself. So my challenge to you is to reduce your dependency on fragile and failing systems, and there are many. This is what we help members do over on the Early Warning Network. I would love to have you join us if you share our concerns and our goal of emergency preparedness, and I'll drop a link in the description. Now, I'll finish up this presentation by pointing out a few more risks. Number 1 is nature and extreme weather. On any given day or in any given second, this is the most likely threat to the power grids. Squirrels cause something like 15,000 power outages per year. And then aside from natural disasters like tornadoes and hurricanes, we have the risk of sub-freezing temperatures, which can disrupt natural gas supplies. Natural gas still accounts for about 40% of national electricity production. And this was the culprit for the Texas power grid's near failure in 2021. Freezing pipes disrupted the flow of natural gas. Number 2 is terrorism and sabotage. This is a far greater risk than power outages because I expect these power outages to be minutes or hours of disruption, maybe a couple days, maybe part of your morning here or an evening there, you're going to be without power. But terrorism and sabotage could lead to weeks, months, or years of disruption, and needless to say, the follow-on effects could be catastrophic. And then finally, number 3, commodities prices and availability could hamper all this planned grid expansion. There's great and wonderful plans about how much solar energy we're going to add to the country and all these, we're going to go build and reconductor all these transmission lines. And none of that's going to happen if it's too costly or if we have availability issues. So my first concern is copper, which is required/preferred for electrical construction. Goldman Sachs started talking about copper shortages a couple years ago. And recently copper prices were up about 25% year to date. They had been up about 90% over the past year. And that was higher than the big commodity spike that we saw in 2020. Global demand for this green energy revolution is going to do this to all the conductive and energy-related metals. Also, there's silicon, which is required for this grain-oriented steel, which is a special kind of steel that goes into step-down transformers. You can't connect big power plants to the grid without stepping down these 300 kilovolt transmission lines to your standard household plugs. The world's top silicon producers are China, Russia, and Brazil. These are 3 of the 5 core countries in the BRICS Plus economic alliance. And this is another component that might disappear or might be very difficult to obtain during a world war. Now, of course, there are lots of other threats out there that we didn't have time to cover. But if you like this video and you found it informative, then please subscribe to this channel. Also, please share this video with like-minded people because this is a realistic threat that we should be preparing for. Thank you for watching, and until next time, be well and stay out front.